Hey, Ben Lopatin with Wellfire Interactive again, and we're back talking about some of the reasons it may be difficult to make changes to your Django app. Previously, we talked about tests, great tests, no tests, slow tests, and bad tests. Today, I want to talk about technical debt. Technical debt's a really big topic, and we're not going to cover everything there is to cover about technical debt in 5 minutes or so. Um, but I did want to talk about what it is, so we kind of can understand what technical debt is as a concept, why we find technical debt, conceptually what it looks like in a Django application, and get an idea of what some strategies are for tackling it. So, first, what is technical debt? Well, technical debt is basically changes you have to make to an application, or that you're going to need to make to an application, that are the result of decisions made in the past. Maybe changes that were not made, that were kind of punted off to the future, or changes that were suboptimal, or due to changes in even things outside of the code base like requirements, or the landscape for the business. They just have to pivot, and you're left with some modules that really need to be reworked to work with the way the code needs to work now. So there's these preconceived notions that technical debt is this awful thing with, these lines of code that are hundreds of characters long, and these awful variable names. Just terrible programmers were involved, and it's just this was the garbage that now needs to be cleaned up, and that certainly that would sound like technical debt to me, but that's not representative of what technical debt is. Technical debt is the manifestation of opportunity cost. Um, and maybe that's not what you want to use, with your boss or with clients. But it's the result of past decisions, and it's the result of, um, you know, code changes that maybe you didn't have the bandwidth to make at the past and expected to have the bandwidth to make in the future. And if you do, then you can make them. And if you don't, these just accumulate, just like debt. If you take on more debt that you can handle, this becomes a problem because you can't pay it down, and you're left with this burden. And it's a very difficult concept sometimes to sell to management. But the reason it's a problem is because it usually represents friction in the rest of the process. So it's architecture that doesn't really fit what you're doing. It's names in your code base that are confusing because they represented how the world worked, in one iteration of the program. And when business requirements changed, you needed to refocus, and you're still stuck with all these names that cause confusion, because they don't talk about the same things, that your code works on now. So this is friction. It doesn't necessarily make your program run worse, but it makes it much more difficult to make changes to the application. So what does it look like in a Django application? Well, I think if you think about names already, that's one of the big things you'll see is, you name models, um, after things in the domain, and something changes. Now you have these models that are all named referencing something that maybe doesn't exist anymore, or it's been used for something else, and so it causes some kind of confusion. Um, it can be apps that become bloated. You have this one app, and it was designed to do one thing, and eventually everything in your business is in this one Django app. Basically, this one module, um, and it's hard to test. It's hard to pull things apart and work on one little piece at a time. That's really common. That's one of the most common, manifestations of technical debt in Django projects. And there's more than that too. It could be dependence on, architectures that are maybe out of date, or third party libraries, referenced in our newsletter. This old pony. You're referencing these libraries or third party APIs that become deprecated or change, and you have to make these changes too. That's a really common form of technical debt in a Django project. Um, so without going into great detail about how you address this, you need to have a strategy for, addressing it kind of on an ongoing basis. Usually, you typically will kind of see what you can do to assess what the state of the application is. Where can you actually identify technical debt, and what kind of levels of technical debt? So if you need to pull everything apart, because it needs to work for a new domain, that might be pretty significant. Whereas changing certain names might be just an exercise in refactoring. Changing something like model names might be a little bit more advanced than that. It's not like a 1 that's not a 10, but it's somewhere in between, because you want to do this in kind of an artful way that doesn't destroy the database when you're making these migrations. So you start with this plan. You start looking at the kind of itemizing the things that you've called technical debt and giving them some sort of ranking, and then you start approaching these. Typically, the lowest hanging fruit, kind of approaching a snowball method, is usually the best way. If you have to pick one strategy, it's a snowball method. Pick the little easy things, get those done, and start building momentum towards the bigger things. You can also, I mean, if there's something that's a big driver, it's really this one big hairy mess, then take care of that first. But you have to, that has to be something that's warranted by your project. So that's an overview of what technical debt is. Why it's important, or why it can be bad, and maybe why it's not always bad. What it looks like in a Django project, and hopefully some a high level strategy for taking care of it. If you have questions about how to approach that, let's say with mentioned with Django model names, or extracting or piecing apart one big monolithic app, go ahead and ask us questions. You can put them in the comments or on Twitter, or email ben@wellfire.co, and we'll be following up as well in future videos and our blog with some strategies for taking care of technical debt.